love to read poetry, to write poetry, to listen to poetry, to hold and to let go of poetry. I love to feel a poem warming up my heart or shivering down my spine. And so today, I'd like to talk to you about why I think poetry should be taught and why it should not. I was exposed to poetry at a very young age. In fact, nowadays most people are, and they don't even realize it. Singing nursery rhymes and reading Dr. Seuss books are recalled as some of our most fond memories from early childhood. But poetry's presence in my education has dwindled from little to barely anything, from a whole unit to barely more than a supplement. I can first recall seeing poetry in my education in 5th grade during the poetry unit, where I was taught things like syntax and rhyme scheme, like 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, E, 5 syllables, then 7 syllables, then 5 again. We barely scratched the surface, and the frivolous terms bared no meaning at all. And for this, it is absolutely no wonder why young kids by the young age of 10 are already groaning at the thought of reading Shakespeare, Wordsworth, or Dickinson. Historians have found that poetry is one of the earliest forms of advanced human communication. And despite the fact that teachers and academics all across the country agree that poetry should be a vital part of our curriculum in a classroom setting, it is time and time again put on the back burner. In an education environment like the Palo Alto High School, where analytic writing is dramatically emphasized over creative expression and the priorities are centered on the analysis of non-literary text, we find that people are constantly questioning their own creative abilities and would rather spend time in the classroom doing anything other than reading poetry. So, today I'd like to talk about the reasons why I think it is so essential and so important that we study poetry in the classroom. First of all, poetry can build a community from the ground up. I know in lots of my English classes, I spent the beginning of the year writing I am poems. You'd say things like, I am from Palo Alto, I am a girl, I am pretty short. And most everybody dreaded this horrible, horrible exercise. But what we fail to realize is that exercises like this enable kids to use metaphors and connect things to share things with their peers that they would have never expressed otherwise. We use poetry to express ourselves, to build creative things, and when you explore yourself and learn more about yourself, it leads to personal growth, which leads to a growth of a more diverse community amongst your peers and a deeper connection with your teacher. Second, poetry teaches reading, listening, and speaking. So these 3 things have obvious connections to the benefits to holistic learning. First, reading. When you're reading a poem, something happens inside of you. As opposed to reading a novel, where the author has thousands and thousands of words to express what they mean, perhaps the curtain really is just blue. But in a poem, the poet lacks the advantage of having so many words, which opens the door to understanding that the curtain probably isn't just blue, and it begs for deeper analysis, which frankly makes learning a little bit more fun. So listening and speaking for me go hand in hand, and the most obvious example of this in poetry is the practice of spoken word poetry. To define, spoken word poetry is the combination of performance and literature. It's kind of like the crossroads between confusing classics like Shakespeare and generational icons like Tupac. When you're reading a poem aloud, when you're saying it, when you have that ability to express through words, You interpret what's in your mind and really have to decipher what it means to you. Personal. A poem can be incredibly personal if you let it. Third, poetry is rhythm, music, and beats. Every poem has its own rhythm. Every poem has a beautiful musicality to it. Whether it's cohesive or not, that's besides the point. Poetry is rhythm and music. It is beautiful. Howard Gardner, a Harvard psychologist, has done a study that has deciphered that musical literacy is just as important as logical and mathematical literacy, spatial literacy, scientific literacy, historical literacy, and trust me, I am all for better math and science programs. I am all for historical literacy. But in a world where that can feel oppressively fact-filled, we need that musicality. We need that rhythm. We need that idea that there's more to life than the syntax of things, as Cummings says. There are 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, not just one. Poetry teaches grammar. This is a little weird because you can learn grammar lots of ways. Through poetry, we see how poets bend and pervert grammar and use them for effect. Teachers can use poetry to explain how run-on sentences de-emphasizes a point, how poets use semicolons versus commas versus dashes to create dramatic speech-like pauses. And finally, poetry is universal. There's a poem for everyone. Words on a piece of paper don't look at your race. They don't look at your gender. They don't care what religion you are. They don't care where you went to school. They don't care where you work. There's a poem for everyone. Poetry is universal. Education demands to be universal. If education is not universal and it's not equitable for everyone, we lose a whole group of people that aren't being touched by our message. So if there's a poem for everyone, everyone can participate. But now it's time to talk about the other side of why I think poetry should be taught and why it should not. In Billy Cullen's poem, Introduction to Poetry, he exposes the truths behind what happens when someone reads a poem. So I'm going to read it. I ask them to take a poem, to hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press it against their ear and hear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into the poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a switch light. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is to tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And I take this extremely personally, and I could talk forever about the benefits of poetry in the classroom, but some part of me, deep inside of me, still holds on to my favorite poems. I don't want to let them go. There's something about that in-class disembowelment of a poem, teachers wringing interpretations out of cryptic stanzas nobody even cares about. They eviscerate the poem. They ruin the transcendent experience of reading a poem. So a final suggestion about reincorporating poetry back into our classrooms, about the importance of poetry into our life. I command each and every one of you to find the poems that you love to find poems that inspire you, to find the poems that you want to wrap around you, to find the poems that make you want to roll around or paint their colors on the wall, the ones that make you feel like you're dipped in a hot mineral spring or an ice bath. Find the poems that connect with the deepest part of your inner workings. Then share them. And together, we can all be well-versed. Thank you.